All right, so today we're diving into something that I think a lot of you can relate to. We've got this article from Abhinav, and it's really got some thought-provoking stuff about how our digital lives, all the stuff we consume online, can really mess with our heads in ways that we might not even realize.
Yeah, it's like this hidden world of influence that we're often just swimming through completely oblivious.
Totally. And what Abhinav points out, and I think this is key, is that some content creators, they actually thrive because of our weaknesses.
Right, like our need to be entertained, to feel validated, to escape reality even. It's like we're handing them the keys to manipulate us.
Exactly. And it's not always malicious,
No.
right? But the effect is the same. We end up consuming content that might feel good in the moment, but ultimately leaves us feeling empty, even worse sometimes. He makes this brilliant comparison to empty calories.
Oh yeah, like junk food for the brain.
Exactly. And he breaks it down into these three main categories. Content that distorts reality, stuff that's just intellectually empty, no real substance, and then things that just trigger us emotionally, bring up all that negative stuff. And the scary part is we often have no idea it's happening.
We're just along for the ride.
So let's unpack this a bit. Let's start with that first one, distorted reality. Abhinav uses this thought experiment about the porn industry, and it's kind of out there, but stick with me on this. He asks us to imagine ourselves as porn producers.
It's interesting because it forces you to look at the motivations behind it, right? Like, what are you trying to create? What need are you trying to fulfill in the viewer?
And is it even possible to create something that lives up to those expectations in real life?
Right, because it's a fantasy. Right?
Yeah.
And not just any fantasy, but one that's designed to be hyper-realistic, almost unattainable in many ways.
Which brings us to the heart of the issue, right? Because when that becomes the main reference point for intimacy, for relationships, for bodies even,
Yeah.
it can really mess with our expectations in the real world.
Absolutely. You start comparing your own experiences, your own partner, even your own body, to this manufactured ideal. And it's a recipe for feeling inadequate, for sure.
And here's the thing, it's not just porn. He then makes this jump, and this might surprise you, to romantic comedies.
Which seem harmless enough, right?
Totally. Who doesn't love a good rom-com?
But when you really think about it, the narratives they're constantly reinforcing. Love at first sight, effortless relationships, zero conflict. It sets up these completely unrealistic expectations for how love actually works.
So those rom-com binges might not be so innocent after all, huh?
It's about recognizing the subtle ways these stories, especially consumed in excess, can shape our perceptions and expectations of something as complex as love.
And it's funny you say that, because Abhinav also talks about this in the context of body image, especially with fitness influencers on platforms like, Instagram.
Oh yeah, and the really blurry line between like fitness goals and the reality of steroid use.
Right. Like, are we aspiring to something that's even naturally achievable?
He uses this phrase, winning the genetic lottery. Like, are you just seeing someone who got lucky in the gene department, or are you witnessing the results of some serious pharmaceutical intervention?
And he gives this great example of the vertical jump. Like, if someone claims to have, insane genetics for muscle growth, but they can barely jump over a phone book, it should probably raise some red flags.
Totally. It's like, come on, let's be real here. It's about developing that critical eye and remembering that what we see online, especially when it comes to bodies, is often a carefully curated highlight reel, not reality.
Okay, but speaking of carefully curated realities, we got to talk about reality TV, everyone's guilty pleasure.
And here's where Abhinav really throws a curveball. Remember that show, Roadies? Get ready for this. He compares it to cockfighting.
Whoa. Okay, that's a bold statement.
Right.
But I kind of see where he's coming from.
Right, because it's entertainment that often comes at the expense of, like, the participants' dignity, their well-being.
And it can desensitize us to that same behavior in real life, right? Like, we become numb to the drama, the conflict, the manipulation.
Exactly. Think about the values that are being promoted. Like backstabbing, drama for the sake of drama. It's like a recipe for creating a really toxic environment.
And the scary thing is, if we're not careful, that can seep into our own lives, like our values, our worldview.
It's a subtle but powerful influence for sure. And what I find even more fascinating is how he connects all of this to our own psychology. Like, what does our attraction to this type of content say about us, both as viewers and as participants in this digital culture?
Okay, so we talked about distorted reality. We touched on the lack of substance in some of the stuff we consume. But what about that third category? The stuff that just triggers us emotionally.
This is where he gets really personal. He talks about his own struggles with news consumption and how it was impacting him.
This is huge, right? Like, We all know that feeling of being constantly bombarded with bad news. It's like, you know you should look away, but you just can't help but scroll.
He calls it this crisis culture, which I think is spot on. It's like this constant state of alertness, this 24/7 news cycle that thrives on negativity and fear.
And our brains weren't meant to process that much negativity all the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's exhausting. And it can have some pretty serious consequences for our mental and physical health if we're not careful.
So we've been talking about, all the potential downsides, the pitfalls of this digital world we're living in. But I think it's important to remember that not all content is created equal, right?
Absolutely. And Abhinav definitely makes that distinction. He talks about how there are plenty of content creators out there who genuinely want to see their audience thrive. They're putting out good stuff. It's just about being able to tell the difference.
Okay, so how do we do that? Like, what are some signs that a content creator is actually, looking out for us, for our well-being?
It's a good question. One thing I always ask myself is, how do I feel after engaging with their content? Like, do I feel energized, inspired, informed even? Or am I coming away feeling, drained, inadequate, anxious? That's a big red flag for me.
Yeah, that's so simple but so powerful. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers game, right? Like how many followers someone has, how many likes, all that. But ultimately comes down to how the content makes you feel.
Exactly. And it's also worth paying attention to their motivations. Are they transparent about their goals? Do they seem genuinely interested in connecting with their audience in a meaningful way? Or does it feel like they're just trying to sell you something?
Right. It's like that old saying, you are what you eat. But in this case, it's like you are what you consume digitally.
100%.
Hmm.
Just as we need to be mindful of the food we put into our bodies,
Mm.
we need to be just as mindful of the information, the entertainment, all the stuff we're feeding our minds.
So what does a healthy digital diet even look like?
It's different for everyone, of course,
Yeah.
but I think generally speaking, it's about finding that balance, staying informed, entertained, connected, without sacrificing your mental and emotional well-being in the process.
So less doom scrolling and more, what, cat videos?
Hey, cat videos have their place. But seriously, it's about being intentional about the content we choose. Maybe that means setting some limits on our social media use, seeking out content that inspires us, educates us, or just, being more present in the real world.
Being more present, I like that. It's so easy to get sucked into that digital vortex, Forget to actually look up and experience the world around us.
It's true. And
Yeah.
sometimes, honestly, the best thing we can do for our mental health is to step away from the screens altogether, reconnect with ourselves, the things that bring us joy. Abhinav talks about how overconsumption of negative news can really throw our thinking out of whack.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. He talks about getting caught in this crisis culture and how it was affecting his fitness goals of all things. Like the more negative news he consumed, the more stressed and anxious he felt, and the less motivated he was to take care of himself.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And this is where understanding the concept of crisis culture is so important, right? It's this constant state of alertness, fueled by this 24/7 news cycle that thrives on negativity and fear. And our brains are wired to pay attention to threats, but when we're constantly bombarded with negativity, it sends our stress response into overdrive.
And that takes a toll, mentally, physically, the whole nine yards. Like our bodies are stuck in this fight-or-flight mode, which is exhausting and totally unsustainable in the long run.
Exactly. And the thing is, we often don't even realize it's happening. We think we're just staying informed, but what we're really doing is immersing ourselves in this constant stream of negativity. This is where Abhinav's own experience is so valuable. Like, he realized he had to make a change. So he started actively seeking out more diverse, more constructive news sources, limiting his exposure to the negativity. It wasn't about burying his head in the sand, but about taking control of his information diet.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Staying informed without letting the negativity consume us. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even start?
Well, for one, diversifying our sources of information is key. Abhinav talks about the dangers of getting stuck in a news bubble, especially one that's hyper-focused on negativity and crisis. It's like anything else, too much of one thing can't be good for you.
Makes sense. So instead of just relying on one or two news sources, we should be branching out, getting our information from a variety of different perspectives.
Absolutely. The same way a varied diet is healthier for our bodies, a diverse range of content is better for our minds. Explore different genres, different voices, different perspectives. Challenge yourself to step outside of your comfort zone a little bit and see what's out there.
And I'm guessing this goes beyond just news, right? Like, we should be looking for diversity in all types of content we consume.
You got it. Don't be afraid to be critical, you know? Just because something is popular or trending doesn't mean it's good for you. Question everything, analyze the messages you're consuming, and be selective about what you allow into your mind. Take ownership of your digital consumption. Don't let yourself be passively spoon-fed whatever algorithm thinks you want.
Be an active participant in your own digital experience. Choose content that aligns with your values, that challenges your thinking, that inspires you to grow. Speaking of challenging our thinking, I want to circle back to something Abhinav said about reality TV. He mentioned that our attraction to this type of content can actually reveal a lot about ourselves, and not always in the most flattering way. What did you make of that?
It's a really interesting point. He suggests that our fascination with the drama, the conflict, often the dysfunctional behavior on these shows, it can sometimes reflect a deeper need for validation or like a desire to feel superior to others. He's not saying everyone who watches reality TV is secretly insecure, but it's worth considering why we're drawn to certain types of shows and what needs they might be fulfilling for us.
And he also points out that constantly exposing ourselves to these, negative behaviors, these attitudes, it can actually influence our own values and worldview over time.
It's a subtle but powerful influence, and one that we might not even be aware of. Think about it. If we're constantly bombarded with images of people being manipulative, backstabbing, just generally awful to each other, it can start to feel normal,
Yeah.
even acceptable.
So what does this mean for those of us who, enjoy a bit of reality TV now and then? Are we doomed to become like drama-obsessed cynics?
Definitely not. Look, it's not about judging anyone's entertainment choices. We all have our guilty pleasures. But I think Ebenham's point is that it's important to be aware of the potential impact of the content we consume, even if it seems harmless on the surface.
So watch with a critical eye.
Exactly. Ask yourself why you're drawn to certain shows, what messages they're sending, how they might be influencing your own thoughts and behaviors.
It's about being mindful, even when we're just trying to relax and unwind.
Precisely. And remember, there's a whole world of amazing content out there just waiting to be discovered. Content that can uplift us, inspire us, help us grow as individuals. Content that nourishes our minds instead of depleting them.
You've given us a lot to think about today, but before we wrap up, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some actionable takeaways. So much to unpack here, right? We've talked about the ways content can shape our views, our expectations, even our sense of self.
It's like this invisible web of influence, right? And we're often caught in it without even realizing it.
Exactly. But the good news is, just by having this conversation, by becoming aware of these dynamics, we're already starting to break free.
Awareness is key. Like Abhinav says, it's the first step in taking back control.
Totally. So where do we go from here? What can we actually do with this newfound awareness?
Well, Abhinav suggests a really interesting experiment. He says, for 1 week, try significantly reducing your consumption of one of these content types we've been talking about.
So if reality TV is your guilty pleasure, maybe it's a week without those shows. Or if you're constantly doom scrolling through news feeds, try setting some stricter limits on your exposure. See what happens.
The cool thing about this experiment is it's not just about deprivation. It's about paying attention to how you feel throughout the week. Do you have more energy? Are you sleeping better? Do you feel less anxious, less stressed?
It's like hitting the reset button on your digital habits and seeing what changes,
Yeah.
what becomes possible when you're not constantly bombarded with those empty calories.
Absolutely. You might be surprised at the positive impact it has on your overall well-being.
I love that. It's such a simple challenge, but it could be really powerful. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway here is this. We have way more power than we realize when it comes to shaping our digital lives.
It's so easy to feel like we're at the mercy of algorithms, right? But we're not just passive consumers along for the ride. We can choose to be more mindful, more discerning, more intentional about the content we allow into our minds and our hearts.
This is about curating a digital diet that truly nourishes us, not depletes us. And on that note, I think it's time to sign off. Remember, a little bit of what you love in moderation is totally fine. The key is finding that balance that works for you. So go forth and create your own healthy digital ecosystem. Until next time, happy listening.